All right, the purpose of this video is just to give you a quick review of the 27 amendments, which are definitely fair game for the AP tests. And instead of putting them in chronological order, I'm going to try and put them in themes, like thematically, so maybe that you see some of the connections and some of the themes that run through some of the amendments. All right, so the 27 amendments in our country's history. Amendments 1 through 10 are obviously referred to as the Bill of Rights. Remember, these are not original parts of the Constitution, hence the fact that they're amendments. They were added in by the Federalists as a promise to the Anti-Federalists, to sort of get the Anti-Federalists to block their opposition to the Constitution way back in the day. And despite the name, the Bill of Rights guarantee your basic civil liberties. All right, First Amendment's obviously a big one. It gives you the freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, and petition. And remember, there are particular clauses in this one that relate to religion. The Establishment Clause prohibits the government from endorsing or creating a certain religion, and the Free Exercise Clause, within reason, prevents the government from stopping citizens from practicing their religious beliefs. Second Amendment, obviously, is a big one as well, guarantees the right to bear arms. The right of individuals to bear arms is the interpretation of the Supreme Court today. Third Amendment, not a big deal anymore, but it was back in colonial times. This amendment prohibits soldiers from being quartered in times of peace. That means like regular citizens can't be forced to house like government soldiers. This is something that the British routinely did in colonial times. So that's why it made the Bill of Rights. Fourth Amendment prohibits against any kind of unlawful searches or seizures. You know the deal with this one. It requires law enforcement to go to a judge. You show the judge probable cause. The judge then gives you a warrant to search. Remember, if law enforcement don't go about this the right way, the exclusionary rule comes into play. And what that basically means is any illegally obtained evidence cannot be used at trial. Fifth Amendment's a big one. It guarantees three basic things. It prohibits double jeopardy, which is being tried for the same crime twice. It also prohibits self-incrimination, meaning you can't be forced to testify at your own trial. Sometimes you just hear people say, I plead the fifth. It means like you're not going to make me talk. And it also sort of prohibits unlawful use of eminent domain. The government can seize your property for their own official use if needed, but they do have to fairly compensate you for the value of that property that they take. Sixth Amendment deals with a lot of trial things, gives you the right to a fair and speedy trial, the right to trial by jury, the right to an attorney, and the right to confront anybody that's making accusations against you through like cross-examination. Seventh Amendment also deals with trial by jury, except this deals with trial by jury in civil cases. So criminal case, obviously, you're fighting over a law being broken, potentially getting sent to jail. In a civil case, you're just fighting over money. The Seventh Amendment gives you the ability to have a trial by jury in these types of cases too. Eighth Amendment deals with cruel and unusual punishment. You can't be exposed to cruel and unusual punishment by the government. Again, from things we talked about this year, the death penalty is not considered to be cruel and unusual punishment. That's just being directed towards minors or the mentally ill. You also can't be subjected to excessive fines or excessive bail. Ninth Amendment was put into the Constitution because one of the Federalists' main oppositions to a Bill of Rights was that they were afraid that future generations would think that these were the only rights that Americans had. So they threw the Ninth Amendment in there to guarantee that you do have rights that maybe just didn't make the Constitution. So that the Bill of Rights is a nice start, but you have lots of rights that are not listed in the Constitution. And the 10th Amendment is also known as the Reserved Powers Clause sometimes. It basically says that any power not specifically given in the Constitution to the national government automatically belongs to the states. So if the power is not given specifically to the national government, it automatically belongs to the states. We talked about the federalism unit, that the sort of interpretation of the necessary and proper clause, the Alaska clause, has kind of limited the significance of the 10th Amendment, but originally it was supposed to limit the power of the federal government and give more power to the states. All right, next category of amendments would be all amendments that relate to voting. 15th Amendment is the amendment that comes after the Civil War that basically grants voting rights to African American males. There are some limits that southern states have put on the 15th Amendment. We'll get to it in a little bit. The 15th Amendment provides voting rights to all African American males. Remember, all females still are not voting at this point in time. The 17th Amendment establishes direct election of U.S. senators by the people. It's the Power to the People Amendment. So if you remember, in the original Constitution, reps were always elected by the people, but the senators were appointed by the states. This changes. This allows the citizens of the state to also vote for their senators directly. 19th Amendment, obviously, is an infamous amendment, gives women the right to vote finally. 23rd Amendment gives the citizens of D.C., Washington, D.C., the ability to vote in presidential elections. You can see the license plate on the screen. D.C., for the longest time, has had taxation without representation on their license plates because they're not part of the state. Some of the voting stuff with them sometimes gets a little confusing. So the 23rd Amendment gives them the ability to participate in presidential elections, gives Washington, D.C. 3 electoral votes. However, D.C. still continues to have taxation without representation on its license plates today because they still don't have the ability to elect any members of Congress. And the 24th Amendment was dealing with one of those things that southern states put into place after the passing of the 15th Amendment to limit the ability of African Americans to vote. And one of these things was the use of a poll tax, which a poll tax is the idea that you are forced to pay in order to vote. 24th Amendment specifically eliminates the use of a poll tax. The 26th Amendment comes after the Vietnam War, where many 18-year-olds in this country are being drafted and sent overseas to fight for our country. But yet at that time, the minimum voting age was 21. Kind of makes sense. I'm mature enough to die for my country. I should be mature enough to vote for who sends me to die for my country, potentially. So this reduces the minimum voting age from 21 to 18. All right, civil rights related amendments. These are things that deal with any kind of like civil rights or equality related issues, and you're going to notice a couple repeats. So the 13th Amendment obviously is right after the Civil War that officially abolishes the institution of slavery across the country. 14th Amendment is a huge amendment. It's important for really 3 different things. The first section of the 14th Amendment classifies all former slaves as citizens of the country. But it's important for a couple other reasons as well. It includes 2 clauses. The one clause in the 14th Amendment is a due process clause. This is the one that has been used to incorporate all of the Bill of Rights amendments to the state governments, and it kind of forces the state governments to also follow the guarantees spelled out in the Bill of Rights that the federal government has always had to provide. And the other clause, you remember, that's included within the 14th Amendment is the Equal Protection Clause, which is really used as the basis of any discrimination lawsuit that occurs in this country, that clause is being violated. The 15th Amendment, again, that obviously gives voting rights to African American males, so race cannot be used to bar people from voting, and we've already talked about that one. 19th Amendment, women's rights, civil rights oriented issue, right to vote, there again. And again, the use of the poll tax, again, it could also be considered a civil rights related amendment and its elimination. All right, amendments that relate to presidents in some capacity. 12th Amendment. This is the amendment that ends the practice of second place in a presidential election automatically becoming the vice president. You'll see now that presidents and their VPs run in like nice organized team, so you're voting for Trump and Pence together, or Clinton and Kane in the 2016 election. That unlike what you had in the beginning of our country's history, where first place was president, second place was VP, the sort of birth of political parties that occurred at the beginning of our country's history made this be a necessity. It wouldn't work to obviously have a Trump-Clinton presidency in 2016. The 20th Amendment deals with presidential and to some degree Congress start times as well. So I put this in the presidential section, but it also relates to Congress. Election day has always been in November, but it used to be that newly elected presidents and members of Congress wouldn't start until the following March. It was a long amount of time to go from being elected to when you would actually take your job. And lame ducks are politicians that are voted out of office but have to wait for the new people to kind of come in. And this amendment was meant to limit the amount of time that lame ducks stayed in office. So basically now election day is still in November, but instead of the new people starting in March, the start time for the new term is moved up to January. So less time for lame ducks to be in office. 22nd Amendment establishes term limits. This is after FDR's record 4 times being elected. Remember, up to the 22nd Amendment being passed, it was just tradition. People didn't want to be elected more than what Washington was elected for. But then Roosevelt was elected 4 times, and it was decided that an amendment would have to be put into place that would prevent presidents from being elected to more than 2 terms. 25th Amendment deals with like presidential succession to some degree. in that the VP officially becomes president if something happens to the president, but also it deals with other things. So what happens if a VP either dies in office or resigns or leaves for some reason? This basically just establishes the fact that a president can nominate a new vice president, and it also outlines terms for like presidential disability. Talks about how power can be temporarily transferred from a VP to a president, or from the president to the VP, in case of like a surgery or some kind of medical issue, and then be transferred back from the VP to the president. And it also outlines the procedure of like what would happen if a president was no longer either like mentally or physically capable of doing their job. Could they be forced out of office? And basically, a majority vote of the vice president and the cabinet potentially could force the president out against the president's will. And then here are some of the more miscellaneous amendments that they don't really fit cleanly into any of the categories. First one is the 11th Amendment. The 11th Amendment sort of like eliminates or limits, doesn't eliminate, but limits lawsuits against the states. So an individual person can't necessarily sue a state. The state necessarily can't be sued itself. I know it's hard to understand. Individuals in the state government can be sued, but the state itself can't be sued. This is an amendment that we talk about all that often. The 16th Amendment is pretty significant. It establishes a federal income tax. We talked about this in the federalism chapter. This then gives the government obviously lots of money. Much of it then can be used to influence the actions of the state governments through grants and things like that. The 18th Amendment establishes prohibition. This makes it illegal to manufacture, sell, or consume alcohol in our country's history. And then, interestingly enough, a couple of years later, the 21st Amendment ends prohibition. The 21st Amendment is significant for a couple of reasons. It is the only amendment that repeals or gets rid of another amendment. That's the only way you can get rid of an amendment, is to pass an amendment that cancels it out, and the 21st cancels the 18th. 21st Amendment is also significant because of the 27 amendments, it is the only one that has been ratified or approved by special state conventions. The other 26 have been approved or ratified by state legislatures, but the 21st was the only one that was ratified by special state conventions. And then the 27th Amendment, which is the last amendment, it's the most recent amendment in American history, deals with congressional pay raises. Congress controls the salaries of all government officials, oddly enough, including themselves. So people had gotten tired of Congress voting itself pay raises. So the 27th Amendment actually continues to allow Congress to determine its own salary. They could vote for a pay raise for themselves, but it's not in effect, doesn't go into effect until after the next set of congressional elections. So this gives the people a chance to express their dissatisfaction by voting out those congressmen before the pay raise takes effect. So members of Congress wouldn't actually see this increase until after the next election. And then obviously this is a gamble that they're putting their jobs on the line. So these are the 27 amendments, and hopefully this kind of helps as a little review as we head into the AP test.